This is Attorney Candace Colucci with Legal Candy. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a great holiday. And we just had the Thanksgiving feast, so I hope everyone has got full bellies and ready to get some information. So we do want to go back and give you guys a little bit of an update on what had taken place from the last kind of stories that we were running. So we will circle back around to the Ybor City shooting that was in Tampa, Florida. And so the most recent update is that they have found, so what the police department was doing in regard to that shooting, and so some of the information that we're able to unravel was that it was a gang-related shooting, and that there was two different groups of gangs, and one of them was potentially 14 and 15 years old, and the other gangs were older than that. So there is an update. There is now a new arrest of a 14-year-old that was in possession of a firearm with a mask. And so he's been arrested for that. And then he was also arrested as a minor in possession of a firearm with a mask. And then also one count of carrying a concealed firearm. So he's been arrested. So what they've been doing is they've been scouring through all of the social media. Like, there's so much social media out there right now. And there were so many videos of it. And they've just been going back through them and literally trying to piece back together what took place. And then also starting to trying to identify people in order to arrest them. And so we actually got a question from, I've got Mary Catherine here from my office. Mary Catherine, say hello.
Hello. Hello. Thank you.
And so Mary Catherine is here today. She is usually in the background assisting, and she's our content writer, and she does all of a good amount of the research here. And so she is here in the forefront today to give us some more, just a little tidbits and information. But so that has been a new recent arrest that has taken place. And so the question that we got from our viewers was in regards to, I'm going to go to the question. The question was literally that they were from the Tampa Bay area, and they had reached out and seeking our guidance as a community. How can they contribute positively in the wake of something like this? Like, what is it that the communities can potentially do? And so, Mary Catherine, if you remember when we were looking at the city council event, and we were there and we were watching some of the videos of people that were speaking, there was a lot of talk about the community coming forward going, hey, what is it that we can do as a community to potentially kind of curb some of this? And from a legal perspective, there's not so much legally as much as it almost seems more about culturally, and how can we support each other? How can we start maybe the conversations in home of, like, how do we start talking to our youth? I mean, that's a huge thing. I have a son, and so I take the time out to talk to him and his friends and say, just through passing by communications of, like, here are the things you need to know. And I'll tell you, I've always thought one of the biggest things that we can do, and I did it while I was in college and in high school, was how do you talk to the youth about those legal ramifications, right? You can't necessarily change anything overnight. But I do think the fact that now the police are being really aggressive about trying to figure out who are all these children that were involved with these weapons, and starting to actually arrest them because of it. I think that can be one thing that starts to change is telling your children and the youth that, hey, there are going to be consequences for carrying a gun when you are underage. That's one thing.
The people at the council, it seemed to me that they were really, really stringently imploring the police to make more of a presence in the community, and to kind of get to know us, get to know what's going on, and don't just jump to this this was a terror situation, or this was an Ybor City, a club situation. That's what I seem to get. It seemed like 80 to 90% were just imploring the police to, come and see us, come to our community, us and see what's,
And that's an interesting question to ask, because we really have to get to the core of what's taking place. That 14-year-old children who just got out of middle school are carrying weapons that could literally murder each other in the drop of a second, right? Because even when you're young, you have that the anger and the rage, which is why somebody so young should not have weapons like that, is because you have that intensity, right? So if you get into a fight with somebody at a normal situation when you're 14 years old, your reactions are sometimes irrational, right? They're at a heightened kind of, sometimes even maturity level. Like you're very immature, so then you've gotten heightened kind of responses. So that's why you really shouldn't have weapons on you. And so I do think that was an interesting kind of situation and an angle to say, come into our communities and meet with us and talk to us. And let's try to figure out what is going on with these youths that they feel that they, need this protection to walk around with, and why. What is the why? So we don't have all of the answers. We're trying to unravel some of them, but I do think that those were good questions that were being asked of, like, come into our community, what is going on? I do think one of the other things that had been brought up that I'll circle back around to is that locking your doors. That's where a lot of these youths were getting these weapons from, as we talked about it, is that making sure that if you have weapons, that you're keeping them safe and protected, so then the youth can get their hands on them. So I applaud the police department for getting another arrest and the continuous efforts into trying to kind of make the streets as safe as they can.
Could I ask a legal question?
Yes, you can.
I'm curious as to what is the significance of the 14-year-old wearing a mask?
Yes.
What is that? How does that add to the fact pattern? What does that do?
So it's an enhancement in the charges and potentially the consequences of it. So it was kind of like we've discussed before about if you're charged with the crime, but it's under the gang statute. So if they can determine that your crime, although if it's just a regular like theft, but if they realize that this theft is part of gang activities and a furtherance of that activity, then now they get to charge it under the gang statute, and now your penalties are more severe. They're not seen as an isolated event. And so in this instance, the possession of a firearm while wearing a mask. So one of the things you cannot do when you have a firearm is you're not supposed to be wearing a mask unless you're the police department or the military, or any of those kind of things. So the fact that he was wearing a mask is going to lead to enhanced penalties.
So it's similar to like a hate crime, the gang strike.
Kind of like that. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we're looking at an advancement in some of those consequences.
Does that lead him maybe to being tried as an adult? Is there a possibility of that at that age?
Yeah. So Florida is very interesting in the fact of, because I did criminal defense when I first started out, and one of the most kind of just mind-boggling things that I ever learned about Florida, every state has different laws, but one of the things about Florida is that Florida does not have a minimum age that you can try a child as an adult. So it all comes down to, usually, because it really is the discretion of the state attorney when they are actually charging, of how they're going to charge somebody. They can direct file you as an adult. That means as soon as the file comes in, the state attorney goes, we're going to file this person as an adult. And most of the time what the state attorney is looking at is they're looking at severity of the crime, and a lot of times their record. How many times have they been in trouble before? And what they're really supposed to be trying to gather is, do we believe that this child, because that's what they are, did this child understand and appreciate the consequences of his action in the realm of adulthood? And should it be charged as an adult? And so should he be facing adult consequences? And so actually, absolutely, is that this, and if they don't direct file, they can actually turn around and then file. They can actually just upgrade it later on, and they can be charged as a minor, and then they can decide to charge you as an adult later on as the case progresses and they get more evidence. But it's a double-edged sword. It really truly is. And when I was in the middle of it, it was really heartbreaking to see, because what ends up happening when you're charged as an adult, you're going to adult jail.
He's 14.
Yeah. And a lot of them are children. I mean, I had a 12-year-old who went to adult jail before. And he was put in solitary confinement. Yeah, at 12 years old. And there's a lot of research behind the mind developing and solitary confinement. It's a whole other conversation. But yeah, so absolutely. So as of right now, I think he's been still charged as a minor, but it can be enhanced to being charged as an adult. And I think that was also some of the stuff that we were trying to employ when we went into communities when I was younger, and we did it at my law school and we did it at my high school. We were trying to go into middle schools and educate the youth on what does the legal system look like, because a lot of them just don't know. They don't know. You know how many kids think that if I get in trouble and I'm a minor, no one's going to know? Like it's all going to be erased.
You're right.
Yeah, I don't know where this came from, but this whole concept of like, oh yeah, when you're 18, there's this magical fairy that like waves its wand and just like erases all of your charges from whenever you're before you're 18 years old, and that's not true at all. It's not. They still can be used against you. They still can be used in scoring you, determine how much of a consequence you're going to have when you're an adult. But I think that those things are important, that we educate the youth, and that could make a difference, is because they'll start going, what I do now at 15 years old does matter. It does matter. And a lot of them just really, truly don't think that. So we will continuously kind of unravel that story and see what takes place. And now we're going to kind of move on into talking about Hurricane Ian. So as we had stated before, so our law firm, we specialize in property damage insurance claims, Colucci Law Group, and we do personal injury and immigration. And so I spend a significant amount of time every day dealing with insurance claims, and specifically a lot of times after hurricanes. So Hurricane Ian hit at the end of 2022, and so we're going to kind of walk you through of some of the legalities behind it that people don't know about. So we're going to start with kind of the background of what happens during, like right before a hurricane is where we're going to kind of take everybody to. And so we'll start with, let's just start like a couple, like usually a week before a hurricane, right? You start getting all of those alerts. And now Mary Catherine is steady following. Who is it that you follow all the time? You're like, you're like, has he said anything? Where's he going? Jim Cantore. Jim Cantore is a weatherman, and everybody says where Jim's at, you don't want to be, because usually that means that the storm is usually somewhere nearby. And so our law firm that we specialize in hurricane damage, and we are heavily watching where hurricanes are at. We also do a lot of recovery efforts that we talked about, is that there are times that we drive into the storm in order to be there as a helping base for people who don't evacuate. I do not advise that to anybody. We are qualified. We have been trained, and we go out there with qualified professionals. Also, everything, as I always got to remember to do our legal disclaimer. So everything that we explain on here does not create any attorney-client privileges. If you have any questions, you can reach out to our office or an attorney. And so with that, we also can jump to our first commercial break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about what do you do, how do you prepare for a storm, what are the legal ramifications if you decide to not evacuate.
This is the TAN Talk Radio Network.
To a couple of days before Hurricane Ian hit West Florida, and so that was September 28th, 2022 is when Hurricane Ian hit. So what people usually don't kind of pay attention most of the time is that if you don't live in an area where there are hurricanes, you don't really know how to prepare for them. And even if you do live in a area where there's hurricanes, sometimes you still don't know how to prepare for them. So some of the things that we'll kind of talk about is, what do you actually do when they start saying where they think the hurricane is going to be? And since I'm in this area, people always come to me and they're always like, Candace, like they'll call me from all over the country and they'll be like, Candace, is a hurricane going to hit there? Is it going to hit here? Is it going to hit there? And I'm the worst person to ask, because as everyone will tell you, is I try not to overstress about it. And I'm like, listen, you're really not going to know until a couple of days before. I would say, in my opinion, because I've dealt with so many hurricanes, is that usually you get a good idea about 48 hours out. And that's really it. So when people are doing things like evacuating, a week before and all of those things. It just moves so many different times and it's hard to keep up. And I mean, Hurricane Ian, that moved so many times. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mom's freaking out and my brother's freaking out, and my mom ends up evacuating to Orlando, where then it turns and it's going to Orlando, and Orlando ends up losing electricity, while Tampa, where she evacuated from, ends up being perfectly fine. So it's always better to be safe than sorry. And your decision to what you're going to do, what plan you're going to make, if you're going to make a plan at all, if you're going to evacuate or not, is really truly, at the end of the day, a personal decision, in my opinion, about your circumstances. And so when we talk about things like a mandatory evacuation, that becomes a little bit of a different legal issue. So that's what we see a lot, especially if we're coming to you live right now from Clearwater, Florida, where there's definitely a good amount of evacuations. And I can't tell you the last time Clearwater, Florida actually got hit, but there has been definitely a lot of mandatory evacuations. So what I will start by saying is that you should have some type of plan in place if you think that your plan is that you're going to evacuate at some point. It's what does that actually look like? And I know it sounds like elementary, but it's like it's writing down, what does that mean? Where will you go? Do you have resources where you can leave? Are you going to, you got to fill up your gas tank? Are you going to bring food with you? Or there's going to be food where you're going? It's like kind of having a plan in place of what that looks like. Where are your dogs, and cats and animals? Mm-hmm. That is huge. Where are they going to go? What's going to happen in the event of an evacuation? But let's talk about these mandatory evacuations, because I get questions of this a lot, of what does a mandatory evacuation mean? So when we're looking at mandatory evacuations, is now usually what happens is that your governor has declared a state of emergency for certain areas. You should understand what flood zone you're in. Flood zone. So FEMA, they have a map. You can go to FEMA.org, and they have a map that's going to tell you where your flood zones are. And most people, if you're like, hey, what flood zone you're in? They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, most people don't know. But that's usually how they determine.
So FEMA?
Yeah, so FEMA will have the map. Mary Catherine will post it on our website so you guys can click on it, so at least you know what your flood zone is. And a lot of times by areas, but also by that flood map, is going to determine what severity you are, how close you are to the water or a body of water, and the likelihood of flooding happens. So flooding is one thing, and then you also have now this hurricane that's coming that's going to potentially do wind damage. So between the two, you're going to get potentially, the governor's going to issue it's a state of emergency, and then the governor can do the mandatory evacuations, and so can your local authorities. And what it looks like, which was an interesting thing when we were kind of going over it, is that it wasn't always, every state has a different kind of law about it, about if you don't abide by a mandatory evacuation, are there penalties? Because people will say there's a mandatory evacuation and they won't go anywhere. So my husband is one of them. My husband refuses to evacuate, and he just will not do it. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, every hurricane he has refused to evacuate, while I have a couple of really close friends who, the minute that it comes anywhere near here, they're like, I'm gone. Bye. I'm out of here.
And your husband's quite a preparer too, isn't he?
Yes, he does have. He's got all kinds of survival kits.
The other way.
Yeah, survival kits and safe, which was interesting because this whole time we were just like, oh, well, he's got the safe, and then we found out it wasn't really waterproof, I think. And so,
oh no.
And so everyone's got their own personal, usually reasons for if they're going to evacuate or not, and then. Us personally, for our law firm, is we really kind of, we're there as a resource for people during the storm, before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm. So a lot of times we are starting to get prepared for making sure we have all of the resources we need in order to help people right during the storm and after the storm, and figuring out where it's at. While I'm also usually worrying about my husband and my son, who also will not evacuate, and my poor French bulldog, Bella Minaj Colucci, who's usually like, what's going on? I'm ready for anything. But so the reason why people are looking at, okay, do you have to evacuate when they say mandatory evacuation? Because you hear that, mandatory evacuations. And what I think sometimes breaks my heart is the people aren't thinking about the people who cannot evacuate. There are people who cannot. And some of the reasons why people are like, there's no way that I can go anywhere is like we were talking about before, pets. Where are you going to bring pets? If you've got big dogs, or can you bring them to a family member's house? You can't bring them to most hotels. So that really limits your ability to be able to evacuate, but also financially. So all of a sudden, most people are living paycheck to paycheck. And then all of a sudden, you're being told you have to mandatory evacuate. What's going to happen to your job? You now have to buy and fill up your car with gas. And then you have to figure out, what are you going to do with all of the other stuff at your house, and what are you going to buy and bring with you? And then where are you going to go? Can you afford a hotel? So there are people who cannot go for those reasons. Also, a lot of elderly. They can't just pack up everything, and some people just cannot physically move because of health issues. And so people don't think about those things. And then
these
people get really
need
stressed.
a more creative plan.
Yeah.
They need a more in-depth and creative plan for their issues.
Yeah, they definitely should. If you're in an area that constantly gets evacuated, you definitely should have a plan in place of what happens if I'm evacuated and I cannot physically go anywhere, because that's what happens a lot. So it's not like just people just being defiant. There are sometimes people who cannot physically leave. And actually, so we're talking about the ramifications of that, is that not every state has any type of consequences if you don't evacuate. And what it looks like is that potentially around 2019 is when I think Florida came up with they turned it to where those executive orders were not actually laws. They were just orders. They were clearly just orders with no actual consequences. But in 2019, we had Florida Statute 252.50 that came up with penalties for a violation of a mandatory evacuation order, which technically made it a law. And do you want to know why I think it came out? That's when it did. Is because there is actually a case which my office, they probably have asked me these questions before, because when a hurricane starts to come, I tell them, this is what we do. We are there before and during and after a hurricane. So I don't evacuate. We're usually going towards it, but my staff too is also trying to get resources to where we're ready to take those calls, because people start calling us frantically. Mm-hmm. They do. We specialize in it, so they're wondering what they should do and where they should go. And so we really kind of like our phones to be able to still be answered remotely, so then we're there as a resource for them. But there was actually this question that was asked in 1998. So 1998. So a common issue that employers face when a hurricane is approaching is whether it can require employees to report to work despite the storm, and whether the employer can take adverse action against an employee who fails to report to work because of the storm. So that was a question asked because there was a lawsuit that took place. So the lawsuit was Gilliard versus Delta Health Group, and it was a Florida case. And what took place is that a nurse, there was a lot of fires that were taking place kind of all around the Volusia County area, and the governor issued an order, put a state of emergency, said, listen, mandatory evacuation because there was all these fires. And so she was a nurse at a hospital there, and she's under a mandatory evacuation order, so she evacuates in order to stay safe. Mm-hmm. And that's the decision that she makes. And when she comes back to work, she gets fired. And so when they say that you're fired because you didn't come into work, even though she let them know that she was not coming, even though she told them hey, there's a mandatory evacuation order, they told her you still need to come in. We are not excusing you from that. And so based on that, so people sometimes ask me this, and I tell them all the time, in the state of Florida, we are an at-will employer state, which means that if you're not under contract, some kind of signed agreement with your employer, they can fire you at any point in time for anything as long as it's not discrimination. So race, religion, retaliation, sexual harassment, like any of those kind of things, they can't fire you for those things, something that's protected. But for anything else, they can fire you for it. They don't have to have a reason at all. They can just fire you. And most people don't realize that. So
including a mandatory evacuation.
So that was the question. The question was, but what you can't fire somebody for is technically under the whistleblowing statute, is that if somebody, and the way they kind of frame it is that if somebody is refusing to do work for you because they are saying that it's going to violate a law. So if you're asking me to do something and my response is I can't do that because that's against the law. I can't break the law if I'm working for you. Right. And then you fire me because of it. That is protected under the whistleblowing statute. You can't fire me for something like that. So that so that is what this case was brought under. The case was brought under saying that she had stated the reason why she didn't come in is because there was a mandatory order, and then she got fired for it. And unfortunately at the time, there wasn't a law in place that said that those orders are actually laws that have consequences if you don't break them. So she ended up losing that case because even though she was following an order, it wasn't actually a law at the time. And so that way she ended up, the firing ended up staying. She ended up having no recourse against her employer. But now I would say it's definitely different because now we're looking at it and now there actually is a law that now backs it up. Now, I have not heard anyone ever get into trouble for not evacuating for that exact reason, is because there are people who cannot evacuate. But just so everybody knows is that if you were not going to work because of an evacuation in Florida, then you technically shouldn't be fired for it, can't be fired for it, and you may want to talk to an attorney and get some legal advice if that takes place. I know my employees are all listening going, okay, all right, because they have heard me tell them we are still working. But I would say, I don't think I even said it then, I even was like, if you don't feel comfortable coming in or you're evacuating, I understand that. Just make sure your phone works wherever you go and that you've got internet access, because we are capable of doing remote work.
We're always there.
Yeah, we are.
There.
We absolutely are there.
Right
it's
after
scary.
it happened, you were bringing them, the sanitary kits. I can't tell you how many people called about that.
I know,
and they were
thank you.
So appreciative
because
of that.
And you were helping guide me. So Mary Catherine was back at home base, and she's a great researcher. So she's figuring out where Jim. So we're following the storm. So we're figuring out where Jim Cantore is. We're driving technically behind him at this point in time to try to make sure that we've got the resources needed in case it does hit. Now, interestingly about the law behind the mandatory evacuation is that some states actually have civil penalties if you do not adhere to the mandatory evacuation, but then you end up needing emergency services. So the whole entire reason behind the mandatory evacuation is not just so you're safe, but it's also because, and people don't think about it, is that they stop responding to 911 calls. And I feel like I need to stress that because nobody told me that until I drove through my first hurricane. I had no idea. But usually when a hurricane hits, the first thing that goes out are phones. So the service usually goes out, but there are a lot of areas that sometimes don't go out. But if you call 911, they are usually logging the calls and they are not coming out. 911's not coming out. The fire department's not coming out. The ambulance isn't coming out. The police department, and that's something that people really don't recognize. So that is one of the reasons why they want you to evacuate, is because their resources are so limited, because they don't want to put those emergency workers in a dangerous situation where they're coming out because, you have a heart attack or a tree falls and it hurts you, and then you've got an ambulance coming on its way to you in the middle of a hurricane, and then they get hurt. So that is some of the reasons why they have these mandatory evacuation orders that people don't think about. And so Florida doesn't have that law about that you would be potentially liable if someone does have to come and save you. But some other states do. And that's interesting because I didn't even really realize that some of the other states do. They will civilly fine you for needing emergency services if you need them after
and
the storm.
Ian was such a long storm. It was such a lengthy storm. Wasn't it 24 hours or something? So you couldn't...
It was 12, I would say, and I'm not going to quote exactly how long it was, but I would say it's about 11 to 12 hours is how long it was from when it started hitting. It was so slow. I mean, we were in Port Charlotte, Florida, when it hit, and it was just going for so long. And it stayed in like one area for just such a long time. And it is insanely scary. And you talk to people who've lived through a hurricane, and the fear that they talk about of watching their roof just like literally kind of just flop in the wind. 'Cause that's what'll happen is the wind is so intense. The wind can get up to 160 miles per hour, but there are also gusts of wind, and there are also mini tornadoes that are in the hurricanes, that those can be, 200 miles an hour. And so that's where you're just seeing roofs are ripping off people's houses, and you can see brick siding just completely just gone from a house. Houses can crumble, and you're watching all of that. And it's really scary. So when you talk to people who've lived through it, they'll tell you it's just, it's hard to explain the fear, because you don't know if all of a sudden you're going to get sucked out or something's going to fall on you. And you're just kind of hiding, and we're reverting back to the only time we ever learned about how to be safe during a hurricane was really in elementary school. Right? In elementary school, they teach you like little fire drills and little hurricane drills. And the only thing that they're showing you is that if you can try to get into the bathtub, like that's one area that's safe.
I still remember that.
Yeah, it's the bathtub. Like that's really it. And then all of a sudden, that's why we're telling people is like, start doing that prepping now. Think about where is the safest place in your home. In our office, I remember I told everybody when we were, a lot of us were still working, when some of them were still at the office working, is that one of the safest areas in some of the places is going to be the stairs, the staircase. Like, so where our stairs are, that was really our safest area. So we've got another commercial break here, so come back with us and we'll continue talking about some of the things you need to know to be better prepared for a hurricane. Well, welcome back. So we're talking about what's taking place during when a hurricane is hitting. So with Hurricane Ian, as it started to make landfall, it's right before you'll see the streets start to get eerie quiet, right? Because everybody is now in a panic mode that if you didn't evacuate, and that's another thing too, is like you got to make the decision to evacuate or not pretty early on, because if you wait until the end, the gas is gone, you're sitting in traffic on I-75, and then eventually everybody just kind of stops and freezes where they're at, and then really just starts kind of praying. I mean, that's really what I felt like was the energy that was in the air. So when we were in Port Charlotte, where we started driving down south, and we weren't really sure where it was hitting, because by then our phones weren't working, and we've got qualified crew, and so we're not really sure exactly where it's hitting, and then that's when we realized we're definitely in the middle of it. So we drove over. A lot of people will hide kind of underneath the overpass, and that's where kind of the wind is not as strong. And so that's where we were to begin with, and then we ended up kind of going in towards, we're trying to make it to a hospital that had a parking garage, another good structure, parking garage. And so that's where, like I said, we'll say it before now we got back from commercial break, but do not try these unless you are a qualified professional. These situations can be extremely dangerous, especially when we're dealing with a hurricane. But so at that point in time, things are just, trees are being like ripped up, and you're seeing like the limbs everywhere, trees everywhere, and then signs. I think the scariest part were like the stop sign and the street signs were they're literally like flying through the air like frisbees. And that's where you realize there's a lot of danger in that, because they become like sharp metal that's being flown around. People who have metal roofs usually they stand up really well with hurricanes, but there are instances where, especially we're talking about the gust of winds that are really strong, where the metal roof just gets peeled back and just goes slicing through the air. And so what we ended up seeing for people who obviously can't evacuate is we ended up seeing an elderly couple that were, we were driving and it was hard for us to see exactly what was happening, but the elderly couple, the door, their driver door had bent backwards.
They were trying to escape or something.
Yeah. So they had last minute tried to evacuate, and they were in a mobile home, and there is a significant amount of mobile homes down south, a devastating amount of mobile homes. And so they had last minute decided that they needed to evacuate. They were an elderly couple, and then they couldn't figure out where to go. So somebody had told them that they could go to a neighbor's house, and they had hid a key underneath the door. So this is what they were trying to do during this storm, before all their phones stopped working. So when they opened the door, another thing people don't think about is when they had opened the door before we had arrived, the wind hit the door and bent the door frame all the way back. So it was literally raining and storming into this vehicle, and they didn't know what to do, so they just laid their seats back, and then they had like three little dogs in the back. Everyone was soaking wet. And so the driver of the vehicle that we were in had seen it, and so this is literally what we were there to potentially do, is if anyone needed help in that situation. And so we ended up pulling over and getting out, and I mean, the water was up to your waist at that point in time, and they were stone cold white. Like, they were just completely white. And so our team worked to get the door closed, and then to make sure that they were okay. And it's just scary. It's those little things that you don't think about. Like a door, like the wind being so intense, the door would literally, like if you happen to be driving through a storm, don't open your doors, because the doors can bend back and they can't get closed again. And so those are kind of people that we were potentially trying to help in case anybody hadn't evacuated. And so those are kind of scary incidents. But then people who just literally were in their house, and then the whole entire roof was gone. The roof was gone. And then we saw RVs. I mean, entire mobile homes that were in pieces on its side. Thankfully, nobody was inside. A lot of them, they had evacuated, but there are some people who hadn't evacuated. There were significant amounts of deaths that took place during Hurricane Ian. And that's another just shock, is that it's hard to calculate the exact number of deaths. And I think if we did a public records request, we still wouldn't really be able to find it out. But there were some really devastating deaths. So on Fort Myers Beach, there were a lot of bodies that they were recovering, and there were a lot of people who were still in their house. There was a neighbor to one of our clients, and that was probably one of the most devastating stories that I had heard, was that he had made the decision to not evacuate. And if you're going to be that close to the water and you're not evacuating, a lot of people will go into the attic. And that's also very scary, the ventilation and how hot it gets for elderly people. But especially because that area has a lot of elderly retired people. And so this man had, it was so heartbreaking, is that the story was that he had decided that he was not going to evacuate. And so he only had a one story. And so he ended up staying there, and he ended up taking his insurance paperwork and his I think will, and put it in a plastic bag, and then just stayed there and waited the storm out, and then ended up, and I guess people tried to help him, tried to get him to evacuate, and he had really just said to him that no, he's decided to stay. In a way that was like, when the story was told to me, in a way like he said, kind of like, I'm gonna go down with this ship. And we all had tears in our eyes. And he died. The entire house was gone, completely gone. And he was gone,
water
to never be seen again.
Too.
And so that's not talking about even the toxic level, but that's just a reminder of the stuff that people don't really talk about on the news. It's like the people who, if you decide that you're going to stay and not evacuate, maybe there isn't criminal penalties, but be very, very aware of the fact that there are life-threatening consequences to it, and you have to be prepared for it. Even when I volunteered after Hurricane Katrina, and that was my first really eye-opening experience with hurricanes, was that what I think was, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous things are elderly, children, and animals. Because it really is the water and the flooding that becomes huge after you've hid yourself from the wind part of it. Then you have the rising water. So you have to be able to swim. You have to be agile to be able to get around. And so I've always said, if you're in that category, you need to really think about evacuating. And if you have loved ones that are in those areas, you really need to help them figure out how they're going to evacuate, because they probably didn't have a plan. And so you should be helping them, going, hey, I'll come and get you. Hey, I'll meet you here. Like, these are the things that we can do, because it's beyond scary during the hurricane, but it's also beyond devastating to the people who potentially have lost their lives that could have been saved had they maybe had evacuated. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things. Okay, so what takes place right after a hurricane? Because we're going over those safety tips, because this is stuff that I just feel like people don't talk about this. You know, mm-hmm. I feel like when I got heavily involved with hurricanes, there was so many things that I just didn't know. And I lived in Florida where there are hurricanes, and I came from Oklahoma where we had tornadoes, where literally this alarm sounds and everybody knows. Like, you don't question it. The alarms, you hear the alarms, and everybody's like, it's been programmed in your brain to find shelter. And if you've got a shelter underground, that's where you're going. Everybody's going there. And it's like, you don't question it. Most people don't go outside, because tornadoes are obviously very, very scary and very dangerous because of the force of the wind, and they're taking up everything, and they're spinning around and throwing it everywhere. But a hurricane seems less threatening, right? Because it seems more like it's water and some intense wind. But it's important to understand that they can be just as deadly, and so they should be taken very seriously. So right after the hurricane is done, some of the things that you have to be really careful for is the flooding and what's in that water. What is in that water? Not just physically what's in that water, because I think we were just talking about the other week was that there were some tigers. There was tigers. Well, I guess if you're near Lowry Park Zoo, there may be some, or Busch Gardens, but no, there were sharks. So there were sharks that were in the water. But electric, like, you can be electrocuted if there's live wires that have literally fallen into the water. And those are things that I didn't think about even when we're doing recovery. It took us a while to get really safe at how we do the recovery efforts. Is that really watching the deep waters, because of not just what's in it, but technically, that it could be still live. Those wires could be live, so you have to be really careful for any wires that you're seeing, but also making sure that the water isn't potentially live and you don't get electrocuted by the water. But the mold was something we were talking about, is that in the air, the mold is so intense that the water becomes so toxic, is that I think I remember one of the deaths that took place right after Hurricane Ian there was somebody that was helping move debris and ended up cutting their leg, if you remember, but he ended up cutting his leg, and that Category 3 contaminated water that got into it created a bacteria infection, and he ended up dying after the hurricane, helping people kind of rebuild and help keep people just kind of get to where they needed to be and made sure they have all those resources. So those are things you want to be really careful for. That right afterwards, do not use any of the water that's coming through. You should be drinking and cooking with all bottled water. It's contaminated within the water source a lot of times. So even if you don't get the alert, you should be really careful about using any of the water that's there, and then not going back until you've heard that the roads are clear. There are so many live wires. There are so much debris that's in the road right after a hurricane, and people start to really try to start going back. But even with Hurricane Ian, one of the most important things that we were starting to hear from some of the professionals is that they were saying that the mold was so toxic in the air that elderlies should not be in the city. They shouldn't be in the city at all until you've given it a good amount of time to just kind of clear the air.
And what can they do?
Yeah.
When they can't go back? I think that's why a lot of people don't leave, because of that. It's just it's a hard situation. I think there's got to be like more than one plan. There's got to be a pre-plan, a plan to go, a plan to stay, a plan like what do you do right after if you stay? Like that poor man that went up into the attic. You know, what if he stayed? What should he have done?
Yeah. And there were and so our heart goes out to anyone who lost family or friends during any of the hurricanes that have hit Florida, but specifically Hurricane Ian that we just had. That was drastic because a lot of times it goes unsaid. Like they'll first talk about on the news that there were 10 deaths or 15 deaths, and then all of a sudden it never gets mentioned again. And I'm telling you, there were hundreds of people that died from Hurricane Ian, and so we just want to make sure we're acknowledging that unfortunately, that was the result of it, and there were a lot more deaths than people have acknowledged. And a year later, because we just had the year anniversary not too long ago, people are still fighting their insurance claims, which we are going to continue to talk about it next week and the weeks afterwards, is what ends up happening after you see it on the news and you're sitting in your home and you're going, oh, that's devastating, that's horrible. And then all of a sudden you don't hear about it anymore. And people really do think, oh, okay, well, that was fine, right? That hurricane hit a while ago and everybody must be doing okay. And I'm telling you, they're not. They're not doing okay. They are still sitting there in homes that are unlivable, that are unsafe homes between the mold levels. And Mary Catherine knows, because we deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's probably the most shocking thing for you, Mary Catherine, was when you first started getting some of those mold results back, right?
Yeah, it was just off the charts.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything that high. Like a lot of these people are elderly, and it's extremely unsettling. It's black mold, it's toxic, and it's just very surprising. It's surprising how much still needs to be done down there.
Yeah.
There's how many claims are still open, how many people still need aid. It upsets me. I think sometimes it's forgotten about because it's not on the news anymore, and that's why we're here
to talk
make
about
sure
it.
To
make sure people know that you're not alone, because that's not the only hurricane, right? So you have Hurricane Ian, you have Hurricane Idalia that hit, you have Hurricane Michael that hit in 2018, the Panhandle, you have Hurricane Irma that hit in 2017, and I can tell you, there are still people with all of those different hurricanes that are still fighting their insurance companies to get fully paid for damages of which they didn't cause themselves. And I think that's the heart-wrenching part for our clients. And I've just started taking like a little bit, and Mary Catherine has seen, is more of like, I've told them, I'm just like, I understand your frustration, and my heart bleeds for you, and it's why I work 7 days a week. It's for you. But here's what I can tell you. After fighting with an insurance company for 3 years, which it's not unheard of, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, still fighting an insurance company in litigation, especially with COVID that shut down our civil court systems, and trials weren't being able to be held for months. It's hard for me to ever tell them, I'm never going to be able to give you the justice that you're looking for, because the justice is that you wanted to file an insurance claim and it should have been paid timely. We have a statute that says that your insurance claim should be paid within 90 days. And that's a reasonable amount of time. 90 days after you've given the insurance company notice of your claim, they should be paying it within 90 days. And I think it just got shortened to 60 days. But even when it was 90 days, that should have been a reasonable amount of time to where you should have been able to put your life back together, rebuy everything that got destroyed, and build your house. And unfortunately,
does that ever happen?
I don't know.
I don't think that.
What? And we know, and we tell
days.
people what happens within that first deadline that the state has, that the insurance companies have, is you'll get your first check, right? And then you'll realize it's not enough money, and then you start fighting for the rest of the money. So we are definitely going to, in the upcoming weeks, we're going to be walking you through what that claim process looks like, so you can better protect yourself against potentially insurance companies, so you're safe. Your most prized possession is safe, your home, and the valuables that are inside of it. So join us next week on Legal Candy. We can't wait wait to see. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. We're looking forward to being able to see you guys next week and give you guys some more little sweet secrets of the law. Bye.